The transgender ideology has taken society by storm in the past 10 years. The idea that a man can become a woman and vice versa has spun off into many different directions. Today's show deals with a very sensitive and mature topic, and this show is not recommended for young ears. My guest today is a man who presented himself as a woman, and not because he was a confused teenager. My guest had an unusual pattern of sexual attractions called autogynephilia. This is a man who becomes aroused viewing himself as a woman. Like I said, this is a mature and sensitive topic, but I know for a fact that some people in our audience have family members who are dealing with this issue, whether spouses, children, or siblings. For some of you, this interview is going to be a godsend. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, founder and president of the Ruth Institute, an international interfaith coalition to defend the family and build a civilization of love. Today, I'm happy to have Ray Alexander Williams, whom we discovered on Substack. Ray is a philosopher, writer, formerly a trans activist, and now a detransitioner and a recent Catholic convert. He found Christ through a radical crisis of conscience. He lives in the Midwest and works in the technology field. He hopes his testimony will bring others from the LGBT community to Christ. I think you're going to be really fascinated by this conversation. Ray Alexander Williams, welcome to the Dr. J Show.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I've been recently discovered your institute and been a big fan. And I think you guys are doing really important work.
Well, thank you very much. I recently discovered you on your Substack page. Okay, so it's kind of mutual that we stumbled over each other in cyberspace. Um, I, One of the things that I'm very interested in about your story is your self-identity and your history. Because after my colleague told me about you, I went and looked at some of your videos on your channel, and you describe yourself as an AGP, which stands for autogynephile. A lot of our followers will not know what that term means. So tell us, what does the term autogynephilia mean?
Right. So straightforwardly, it means love of oneself as a woman. And this was a term created by the academic researcher and clinician, Dr. Ray Blanchard, back in the late 80s, who worked at the Toronto Gender Clinic. And he was doing intake on patients who were seeking sex reassignment surgery in Canada. And he was like screening them out, and he started making these observations. And one of his observations was that these male to female transsexuals came in two broad categories, where he distinguished between the homosexual transsexuals, which are essentially, very effeminate, same-sex attracted men who transitioned or sought out transition largely for wanting to fit in with their natural effeminacy. Like they're just kind of effeminate as young boys. And the other class of male to female transsexuals is what he called the autogynephiles, where these are heterosexual men, so men who are attracted to women and have always been attracted to women, or bisexual. He discovered for those people, they kind of like, they transition later, they're less effeminate, they're more masculine in their behavior, they have more stereotypical like computer programmer, they have like, these masculine histories and life histories, like being in the military and stuff. And so he came up with this model called the two-type typology of male to female transsexualism, where there's two major categories of what motivates the transition. And in the case of the men who are attracted to women who want to go on and develop a trans identity, the idea is essentially that it's an inversion of heterosexuality. So you are attracted to women, but you're also attracted to the idea of yourself being a woman. And so this is and he just characterized this as a paraphilia, or a fetish, which is why the vast majority of trans women, trans identified males, before they come into their identification as being transgender, they often go through this exploration of, am I trans or is it just a fetish? And they report a history of things like fetishistic cross-dressing, watching like transgender pornography, and other such things. And so there's this kind of a sexual component that drives this, which, and in both cases, so the idea that it's the homosexuality that drives it in the one case, and then it's this paraphilia that drives it in the second case, that obviously goes contrary to the mainstream narrative, which is that transgender identity, you're born with it and it's a root cause. Whereas Dr. Blanchard's theory is that the transgender identity and the cross-sex ideation and the desire to transition and the gender dysphoria is a downstream byproduct of essentially your underlying sexual drives. So it's obviously been an incredibly controversial theory because it runs against the kind of born this way innate gender identity theory. And it's been, a lightning rod for controversy in
Yes.
the academic community.
And what I've noticed about that, and this is not something I know very much about, so and that's one reason I wanted to talk to you, because I think you can inform me and make me better educated about it. But one of the things that I've noticed is that some of the men become angry at the thought that what it is, that they have a paraphilia. It's like an insult to them, or they take it like that. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So there's a famous researcher who wrote about autogynephilia named Anne Lawrence, and he himself was a trans-identified male who had self-identified as an autogynephile. What Anne Lawrence discovered was that he wrote a paper called about narcissistic rage, which is common in this population, where essentially because the paraphilia develops and evolves into a psychological autobiographical self-concept where they idealize themselves as a woman and they internalize this model of themselves as a woman. When society doesn't validate that conception of womanhood, it creates ego dystonia, or it basically conflicts with their self-image and their understanding themselves, because essentially to say that your womanhood is caused by a distorted form of male sexuality, it conflicts with their self-image, which triggers the narcissistic wound, and that narcissistic wound triggers rage, which is why they get so animated about this topic, because it basically conflicts with the story they're trying to tell to society, which is that, hey, we're just like any other woman. I'm just a regular woman, but I just happen to be trapped in this male body. But otherwise, in all
Mm-hmm.
respects, in my internal psychology, my mind and my soul, I'm a woman just like any other woman. But when
Mm-hmm.
you say that, no, actually, you're a male with male typical sexuality that's been distorted in some way, that counters their own self-concept.
Right, right, and it's offensive to them. It's not nearly as flattering a portrait as the
Yes,
portrait they've
and
painted for themselves.
correct. And it makes sense because if you're in a job and you want to transition on the job, male to female, it's so much easier socially to give a story like, hey, why are you doing this? Well, it's because I'm a woman on the inside, because I have because my gender identity, and so that tells a much more socially acceptable narrative. Whereas if you're just saying like, oh, I'm doing this because I have a paraphilia, that's going to make people comfortable. You're not going to be
Oh,
as
right.
accepted. So and so this is the fear that a lot of people have, even people who acknowledge that there's broad um, truth to the two-type typology, because almost everyone who's familiar with the transgender community like recognizes intuitively that there is these different types. There's like your kind of
Mm-hmm.
highly effeminate type who's going to be like a cosmetologist or a hairdresser, or like industry and fashion, versus like your really geeky, autistic, nerdy trans woman who is super masculine in all appearances. um,
Right, right.
and
Uh, Ray, are there any prominent examples of this that people might recognize who they are? I mean, I have theories, but maybe you do as well.
So the most, so one of these things is like, you can't definitively,
Right.
diagnose someone with this, but it's one of those things is like, once you know it, you just know it. Like once you see it, you just know it. And it's like, probably the most common example is Caitlyn Jenner. Um,
Bruce Jenner. You mean Bruce?
Bruce, yes.
Bruce, right.
Yeah, yeah,
I remember when he won the decathlon, the Olympic
yes.
gold medal in the decathlon,
So a lot of people don't,
which is a very manly thing to do, could I point out, and that we're all supposed
yes,
to believe he was really a woman all along, that's a little much.
yes.
But anyway, yeah,
So,
Bruce Jenner, it
and I'll
has
give you
always
a
occurred to me.
story,
Yeah. Sorry, go
which is
ahead.
that prior to his big reveal on the Vanity Fair cover where he came out, all made up and done. He had all the surgeries and done, and like over like a period of a few months. Prior to that, he did this big interview with Diane Sawyer on 60 Minutes, where he talked about his life story. And this is, he was still kind of in like presenting as a man. And he told his life story, and he shared this story of like how he had a lifelong history of secretive cross-dressing, where he'd go off on a trip in a hotel and dress up, and also turns out Kim Kardashian or someone in that family said that he had been stealing like his daughter's clothes, which is kind of indicative of the paraphilia. But it was clear evidence that he had a lifelong history of fetishistic cross-dressing. And so that is obviously like, paradigmatic of the autogynephilic experience, particularly for that older generation. And this ties into my own story because when I was, prior to my transition, prior to identifying as trans, I was identifying as a cross-dresser. And I was seeing a therapist at the time for unrelated issues. But we started talking about my cross-dressing. And this is like right in 2015, the trans tipping point, Bruce Jenner's in the news, Laverne Cox was like all this like, a trans tipping point on the New York Times. It was like the big thing culturally. And and my therapist at the time said, "Oh, you should watch this interview with Bruce Jenner." And so I realized like, wait, like my story sounds a lot like him. I've also had a lifelong history of fetishistic cross-dressing, and this is supposed to be a trans woman. So like at that moment, I realized that my history of being just a cross-dresser was not incompatible with being a trans woman. And then I went on Reddit and I started asking these questions like, hey, is having this history of fetishistic cross-dressing, like, does that incompatible with having a valid identity as a transgender woman? And pretty much everyone online in these communities told me, no, that's not only doesn't invalidate you, that is normal. So I realized that my story of having a history of fetishism or paraphilic desire underlying my motivations, that is normal in the community. And so it was actually Bruce Jenner was like instrumental to my own like identification process.
And so for a while then, just to be clear, you identified yourself as an autogynephile.
No. So
Okay.
like when I first transitioned and identified as trans and got into the trans community, like if you get into the community right away, you'll all these trans identified males that they're familiar with the concept, but they've written a lot of their own responses to this research trying to debunk it. And they push this narrative that this research is pseudoscientific, it's debunked, it's unfalsifiable, there's no evidence for it, this is just like bigotry. And they try to really paint the researchers who came up with this as like, bigoted and evil, and it's like pseudoscience, it's junk science, it's been disproven. And so I read all that literature from within the community debunking it. And I was a hardcore trans activist. So I actually published a book as a trans activist, a philosophical, feminist pushing of transgender ideology. In my book, I talked about autogynephilia as a concept. And while I recognized it sort of applied to my life history, like I repudiated the conceptual implications of the theory. And so I kind of knew if I had to pick between whether I was in the homosexual, transsexual type or the AGB type, I knew I was more closely with the AGB type, but I rejected or attempted to reject like the theoretical implications, which is that like, that is like the sole motivation or something, or that is like, it was just like, it's like one of many motivations. I kind of had all these different ways to spin it around. But I was probably more self-aware about and more willing to talk about my history than a lot of trans women who completely just like suppress that for social acceptability reasons.
So in other words, what you self-identified as transgender, and you were more open to the autogynephilia idea conceptually, but that was not what you didn't pin that label on yourself at that time.
Correct. Yeah. It
Okay.
wasn't until 8 years later, back in 2023, when I detransitioned, that I actually got acquainted with the literature more with a more open mind, and I realized that, like, hey, actually, this is the explanation for why I transition, like where all this comes from. It explained my life so well. And then I started like getting really familiar with like the research, and I realized like, no, this has not been debunked. This is not pseudoscience.
Right,
This is like
right,
well
right,
established theoretical
right, right.
concept that, and there's an active research literature being done on this concept, but also it's controversial, and it's hard. It's hard. I'd probably get hard to get funding in a lot of research institutions for this. So
Tell me about it. Tell me
you'll
about
get
it. I
you'll
mean,
get
it's comparable.
canceled.
Yeah, it's comparable. I mean, really, what we're dealing with is that the establishment position is that homosexuality is an inborn immutable trait. Being born in the wrong body is an inborn immutable trait. And the idea that there could be some kind of psychological precursor to either of those conditions is like they don't want to deal with that. They don't want to think about that.
Right.
And
Exactly.
that's what makes your story interesting to me, because you say you transitioned and then you detransitioned. In order to do that, you had to be willing to re-examine and reinterpret your own past, and look at what you did and why you did it, and say, wait, I tried this, it's not working, and here's why, and so on and so forth. I want to ask you about the concept of transition, though, as it applies to your particular case. So you say you transitioned in 2015. Is that, am I getting the
Yes, that's
timeline?
correct.
Okay, so what did in your case, what did transition mean? Did it mean medical procedures and interventions? Did it mean social stuff? Did you move to someplace new where nobody knew the old person? And how did that work for you, Ray?
So I was in grad school at the time. I was getting my PhD, which I didn't finish the degree program, but I was in the program. And So first off, it just started off, clothing. I wanted to cross dress all the time, and it's funny. That was like my initial motivation is like I wanted to sort of bring my cross dressing out of the bedroom, like into the public world, into my social life. And I initially did not want to go down the full blown medical pathway. I wanted to live this kind of like dual life. And the very first transgender identity I latched onto is called bigender, where you identify as both male and female. Because I was kind of like, I
Oh,
didn't really have a lot of like strong hatred of my masculinity or like my male social role, like growing up. But then I quickly realized as I started like, cross dressing out in the public that like, hey, you get a lot of weird stares, this is not comfortable. This is like, and so I realized that like, if I'm going to pull this off, like, I need to blend in better. And then so I basically very quickly realized that like, no, like I need to modify my goal. I want to make the goal to pass better. And so the first thing I got laser hair removal on my beard. I know it doesn't look like it, but my beard was much thicker. And I actually got like about 11 rounds of laser hair removal on my entire
wow.
beard. I just have a
Wow.
like thick beard hair, but people always say like, oh, like you never got your hair removed. But no, like before I got it done, when I shaved clean, I had a very strong shadow, whereas now I shave clean, there's no shadow. So it definitely did permanent, hair removal on my beard. That was the first permanent medical decision I did. But what's interesting about gender dysphoria and autogynephilia is that as you make it a conscious goal for yourself to pass yourself off as the opposite sex, that conscious goal can induce novel, new gender dysphoria that didn't previously exist. Because I never grew up, for example, hating my apples apple. I know I never like was staring in the mirror like, oh, I hate this, I hate this. But when I made it my goal to pass as a female to blend in better, so I don't get discriminated against because I'm cross dressing, now I realized that my Adam's apple was an obstacle to my goal to pass myself off as female. And so that created a new sense of discomfort or dysphoria. So rather than the dysphoria being the cause of the transition, the going down the transition pathway caused um, the development of more dysphoria. So the transition worsened my dysphoria. It actually created most of my dysphoria. And
Wow.
then after that, I got very quickly after that, I got on cross sex hormones. And that was, thank God that was the only intervention I did was on the hormones. I never got any surgeries or anything. And so when I got off the hormones 8 years later, most of my bodily function have returned back to normal. Now I haven't had my fertility tested. And now that I'm Catholic, the ethics involved in that are complicated, to say the least, from a Catholic sexual ethics perspective, doing fertility testing. But nevertheless, there could be permanent effects to my fertility from that. And so, yeah, and also, it caused severe health problems. In 2020, I had a pulmonary embolism and I had pancreatitis due to elevated triglycerides, which almost could have killed me. Partly that was due to like a history of smoking, but the combination of smoking and estradiol in males greatly increases your risk of deep vein thrombosis and blood clots, which led to a pulmonary embolism. So it was very serious.
So this is very interesting to me. The process you're describing. My sense is that among autogynephiles, it's not unusual for them to not have surgery, to not have the bottom surgery type of thing.
Yes, I think in the statistics I've seen, it's about 5% actually go through with the full blown
Hmm.
bottom surgery. Which I hate that term bottom surgery because it's a euphemism for flaying open your penis and inverting it, which it makes it
Oh,
sound so innocent, but it's a brutal, gruesome process that has massive
yeah,
complications.
yeah,
And they'll try
yeah.
and
I've heard
spin it
about that.
saying that
Yeah,
like, oh, the regret rate is 1%, but you can't trust those statistics at
right.
all.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. We know about that. You can't trust the statistics. I'm interested though in the feelings that you had around this as you're going through this. When you say to me that you become aroused, imagining yourself as a woman, okay, that's the hallmark of autogynephilia, and you wanted to be, and before you transitioned, you would sometimes cross dress, and you would, and this was stimulating to do that. Is that?
yes, very much so. I mean, it started in childhood. So the very first manifestation in terms of my paraphilia was an intense erotic fixation on nylons and hosiery. My mom would like throw away stockings in the trash can, and I would like kind of steal them, and I would like, and I was, it was like it was like the sensation, the tactile sensation was very appealing to me for whatever reason. I was very sensation seeking, and and I've actually talked to a friend of mine who's like a very smart researcher studying this topic, and she has speculated that there's a connection between ADHD, sensation seeking, novelty seeking, and developing of escalation of paraphilia due to
Hmm.
a really desire to go down novelty seeking and sensation seeking. That was very true in my case. So it started off as an intense erotic fixation on like pantyhose and nylons and stuff, which is actually a very common like fetish object with among autogynephiles. And then but then like over time as I got into my teenage years, I discovered transgender pornography, and the sort of like and then when I got my own car, my own freedom, I could like kind of go buy my own things, and then it just sort of escalated and escalated and escalated and escalated until eventually it wasn't just the pantyhose. It was like buying other items of feminine clothing. But it's mostly focused on like clothing, and it be these ritualistic masturbation sessions where kind of dress up and watch pornography and kind of get into these it all leads up to the climax. And then very typical among autogynephiles is what's called the binge purge cycle. It's the binge purge cycle of shame, where you basically you build up to that point over these long sessions or whatever, and then you reach climax, and then immediately you feel a sense of guilt and shame, and then you throw away like your whole stash of like items or whatever that you've collected, and this kind of fit of urge. So and then but then and then you suppress it for a few months, and then like the desires come back, and that's called the binge purge cycle. And this has been highly common thing in this community.
And so when you decided that you wanted to be dressed as a woman all the time, um, what did that mean for your arousal pattern? Would you be, if you're out in public in a dress, were you aroused doing that?
No, not really, because the thing
Okay.
is, you get habituated to the stimulus very quickly. So let's say, like, previously, you might like put on a pair of panties or something, and then you get aroused. But if you wear them every single day for 30 days, then you get habituated to the stimulus. It doesn't really do anything for you. So at that point, I had been, cross dressing like inside my home like all the time, and so it kind of became desexualized, and which is a very common narrative. And this is actually one of the arguments that the trans identified males will make to sort of try and deny that they are autogynephilic. They say, well, once I transitioned, all that stuff went away, and it just felt comfortable. It just felt normal. I just felt like myself, and also when you go in the hormones, it suppresses your libido. And
Yeah.
so a combination of habituation to the stimulus, getting it normalized, and then the reduction of the libido due to the cross-sex hormones, it sort of desexualizes it. And Lawrence, that researchers are talking about, has this paper where he describes this process, or basically like there's an erotic component to autogynephilia and a romantic component. So you can basically have a
Oh.
very like erotic fetishistic component prior to the transition, but then after transition, it becomes more of a emotional attachment to the idea of oneself as a woman. And that, and this population comes in a wide variety of cases. So I'm kind of generalizing to my own case, but there's different subtypes within this, depending on other factors. For some people, autogynephilia only manifests in like completely fetishistic behavior, but there actually are some within Ray Blanchard's original cohort. There's actually a cohort of asexual who had very low libido, and they're often very autistic, and their sort of idealizations of womanhood are more on a imaginative and emotional basis. So it's not necessarily always erotic or fetishistic in nature. It can be more in the idea of like, and also in a weird way, the sexuality can make you dislike male sexuality because it's called what's called autoandrophobia, which is hatred of oneself as a man. So these heterosexual men, I think, due to attachment wounds and insecurity, due to not fitting in with the other boys, because it's very common for the AGPs to say things like, I'm not like the other boys. I'm more sensitive. These sensitive young autistic boys are very commonly known to be autogynephiles. And so for that particular group, the AGP manifest in terms of a intense dislike of their male sexuality because they realize that having male typical sexuality makes them like the boys they're disidentifying with, because it's like, that's like the macho guys. They don't want to be like that. And so
Mm-hmm.
these are the ones who are more likely to get the bottom surgery because they've grown up with an intense dislike of their genitals.
And so that in a way, it's a similar wound to what you hear from men who left the homosexual identity behind. They'll often say that they had a masculinity wound, but in their cases, they were drawn to other men to fill that wound, to fill that
Right.
gap that they felt.
Right.
But there's still the wound in each case, but it's manifesting differently. And I'm struck earlier in our conversation, you used the term narcissism, and that word keeps coming into my mind as you're talking because what I'm hearing you say is that there's a disordered there's a disordered relation to yourself. It's not just your relation to the opposite sex it's or to
Yes.
manhood in general. It's a disordered relationship to yourself because you become the object of your own erotic longing.
Yes,
Um,
that's correct.
is that
That's
true?
correct.
Am I reading too
Yes,
much into
there
that?
is a theoretical model to explain autogynephilia that's been developed by various researchers called the erotic target location area model.
Oh.
Essentially, normal sexuality, we have an erotic target, which for normal healthy sexuality, the erotic target is not only the opposite sex, but it's someone who's not self. So it's another person. It's relational. So somewhere in the wiring, the sort of logic that says your erotic target must be not self gets broken, such that the erotic target is now, you're still attracted to femininity, but your target becomes self. So you have a location error. So you're locating the object of your sexual attraction in the wrong place, rather than locating it in the properly ordered place, which is in another person of the opposite sex. You're locating it inside yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, this concept of a erotic target location error is generalizable across different paraphilia. So this is not the only case. I'll give you an example. So for men who are attracted to obese women, there's a subset of them who are attracted to the idea of themselves being obese. Of the men who are attracted to amputees, a subset of them are attracted to the idea of themselves being amputees. Of the men who are attracted to children, there's a subset of them who are attracted to the idea of themselves being children. So this is called it's like an auto-sexual component that is generalizable and seen across various different paraphilias in men. So this is not the transgenderism is only one manifestation of this general pattern of erotic target location error.
That's really interesting because some of the another generalization of transgender ideation is body dysmorphia generally. So instead of being gender dysmorphic, you think you're too fat. It's anorexia would be the analog to that in that case. But this is um, say it again.
Erotic
Erotic
target
target.
location error.
Erotic target location error. Do you know some of the therapists that I've talked to, because I've now talked with a number of different therapists who try to help people deal with unwanted same-sex attraction, and they have noticed that sex addiction and same-sex attraction, there are a lot of commonalities amongst where these things come from and so on and so
Right.
forth. But the
So
term that I've heard, the term I've heard them use though, is they talk about the arousal template, which is similar, but I think not quite the same. And yes, and I found that, and they think that that's a more robust, helpful concept than the concept of sexual orientation, for example, because we have the idea sexual orientation is inborn and it can't be changed, and so on and so forth. And if you think of it in terms of an arousal template, you go, well, now that doesn't sound nearly so plausible. That as a baby you would have a preloaded arousal template into your head, that it would always be this or that or the other thing,
right,
and that would have nothing to do with the environment, with what you encounter in your life outside yourself. That becomes much less plausible. I'm going to have to think about this concept because I've
right.
never heard this
The
before.
other, it's also called erotic target identity inversion. So that's another. So if you look up either erotic target location error or erotic target identity inversion, but I want to come back to the idea of same-sex attraction, because
Oh yes, please.
there's sort of an interesting development of the theory that Ray Blanchard noticed, which is this concept of called pseudo bisexuality. So even though the model postulates that autogynephilia is an inversion of heterosexuality, so it's an inversion of the attraction to womanhood, many autogynephiles report same-sex attraction, which it sounds counterintuitive. Like, so you're attracted to women, but you end up having sex with men. Well, how does that work? And so there's this model called pseudo bisexuality, where essentially you're not, so for a true same-sex attracted or typical like of the homosexual transsexuals, their attraction is more like they're attracted to like the masculine, the musk, the testosterone, the beards, whereas for the autogynephiles who have pseudo bisexuality, they're not attracted to men. They're attracted to how men validate their own sense of femininity. So they're attracted to men because often the men are able to play the dominant role in the submissive fantasy, for example. So, or they'll just like to be with men only because they're interested in being penetrated, and that's something a man can do. So they're not actually really like attracted to men. They usually don't get into relationships with men. But in my own case, like I've had sex with men, and when I was an autogynephile, even though I don't find men attractive, I find I'm really only attracted to women. But I've had sex with men because the men validated my submissive fantasies, which is very common. And there's some speculation that there can be autogynephiles with like a more complete form of pseudo bisexuality that manifests in more or less exclusive patterns of dating men, so that on the surface they look like gay men, but in reality they're actually autogynephiles. But that's more a theoretical speculation. It hasn't really been borne out, but it's an interesting theory that accounts for some of the weird things we see in the phenomenon, where you have, for example, this is why people who have sissy fetish, cross-dressing fetish, they often will go on Grindr and seek out relationships with men, even though at the point of orgasm they feel shame and disgust, and they realize, oh, this is disgusting, I'm not attracted to you, how could I do this? Well, it's because the paraphilia drives same-sex attraction.
Hey, a quick shout out to our sponsor, realestateforlife.org. This is the most pro-life, pro-family way to buy or sell a home. Go to realestateforlife.org. You'll be connected with a Christian realtor. Part of their commission will go to the pro-family charity of your choice, the Ruth Institute, for example. And it costs you nothing at all. It's the most pro-life, pro-family way to buy or sell a home. Go to realestateforlife.org. We're going to have to stop talking about this because we're getting into a weird area, in the immortal words of Bill Murray. But the one thing I do want to kind of clarify here, though, is that if I understand this correctly, this particular type of man that you're talking about, the value in being with a man is that the man is responding to you as if you're a woman, and you're getting it's it, in normal sexuality, it's man for woman and woman for man, and I become more aware and involved and appreciative of my own femininity in response to my husband's masculinity, and vice versa. That our differences highlight who we are, and we come to understand ourselves in relation to the other. And so for the person with this particular kind of disorder, and you can see now the way you're spelling it out, there's a couple layers of disorder, but
Oh, yeah.
it's the fact that the person is validating, the male sex partner is validating their female identity. That's how they're
Exactly.
experiencing it.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, this is really, Ruthie's, if you've listened this far, God bless you 1,000 times, because this is pretty weird stuff. I mean, it's interesting in a way, but I think it's important to talk about it. And I appreciate you being willing to talk to me about this, Ray. And I appreciate how candid you've been on Substack and how candid you're being now. I want to go now, if we could, to just talk to us, if you don't mind. What do you think is the origin of this type of fetish? I mean, you've talked about your mom's stockings, but your mom's stockings didn't appeal to you out of nowhere. I mean, there must have been I don't know if you have a theory about your own causes of this. I gather that you don't think you were, quote, born this way. And so if you think you're not born this way, then that suggests there's some other explanation. And do you have a theory about what that would be?
um I don't have a particular theory. And you know when I actually did an interview with Dr. Ray Blanchard on my YouTube channel, and I asked him about this, and he didn't say that like no one's born AGP, but some people might be born with a concupiscence or a more predisposition towards developing paraphilia. So in that case, depending on the environmental um, development pathway in terms of what you get exposed to, that could lock in certain paraphilic. So, for example, if you happen to be a young boy and you're crawling around the ground and you touch your mother's stocking or something, and then you incidentally have a you know some emotional or arousal component, that could kind of like wire together. So that's one hypothesis. I don't really know, but I mean, but also I've been reflecting a lot, kind of more, because it's one thing to explain like having these kind of like incidental, like weird inversions, but it's another thing to say like how does it escalate to full blown identity where you're going down the full blown pathway. And definitely the pornography was a big factor. And the other thing is like, I'm doing some reflecting, and I think I definitely had a masculinity wound because my father was very much like he was very mechanical. He was a handyman. He was very much good with cars, fixing things. The typical guy stuff. And I was not good at that at all. I didn't really relate to that aspect with my father, and I was homeschooled by my mother. So I spent like most of my life I was very close to my mother, and so I kind of think that there was like a sense of insecurity where I wasn't, and I think that failure, and partly I've developed this theory from watching some of your content, reading some of your
Oh,
content
really?
about
Oh, wow.
about
Okay.
how there's these masculinity wounds.
Yeah.
I was sort of
Yeah.
thinking like, well, because you explain like a lot of like same sex attraction comes through like attachment wounds, and it's like, not having feeling insecure, and not feeling like the other boys.
Right.
So I think that was definitely true in my case, but I think there's a confluence of factors. Now I know, so there's not a lot of evidence for this, but people have commented anecdotally that male to female transsexualism seems to run in families.
Hmm.
So if there is a autogynephilic teenage boy, it's very common for the father to often have some signs of autogynephilia as well. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're born like that, because that could just mean a a predisposing factor to developing paraphilia that needs a environmental trigger to unlock the latent disposition or
Right.
the or
Right.
the behavior. And then particularly it's really critical, for example, if you get exposed to pornography at a young age, like that can have a real because there's one thing to like have a proto version of this, but it's an entirely different thing to have a version of it that fully escalates into full
Yes.
blown paraphilia that is incredibly disordered and takes over your life and like causes you to blow up your family, ruin your life, and like go down this pathway and medicalize and do all that stuff. So like there's a lot of people who have very mild forms of this, and there's some people who have very extreme forms of this. And so um, I don't think it's necessarily completely unscientific to suppose that there may be some predisposing factor.
Right.
But I don't. But there hasn't been enough research on this. This is all
Yes.
speculation.
Yes. And the problem with the born that way theory is that it cuts off the research and the speculation into other alternative explanations. And I do think that there are some medical conditions, and the LGBT community hates it when you say this, but there are some complicated behavioral psychological conditions that definitely have a genetic component, but then are triggered by things in the environment. And I think schizophrenia, for example, is like that. There seems to be some genetic component to it, and then you put a couple of big stressors into a person's life, and boom, it doesn't
Right.
manifest until that happens. And so that it's plausible to me. What you're saying is plausible to me, but it sounds like the honest answer is that we don't really know.
Yes, that is the honest answer. But
Yeah,
you
yeah, okay.
mentioned like major life stressors locking that latent potentiality, like
Yeah.
schizophrenia. I think that happens in autogynephilia as well, because it's very common for. There's this concept in the community called your egg cracking, where you suddenly realize you're trans,
Egg?
and
What is it
it's
again?
called
Say it again.
it's called egg cracking. Like when your egg gets cracked, it's when you suddenly realize that you're trans.
Oh,
That's
okay.
the concept in the community. And this egg cracking frequently happens during major life crises like divorce and
Yeah.
or you
Yes.
just your wife just got pregnant, you just had a baby, you just got fired, or your career is stagnating, or some these major life events. And so there's been this connection that I've made between this sort of egg cracking and midlife crisis in men, because midlife crisis is very common in men. It's a common phenomenon, and that process involves a breakdown of autobiographical self-narrative identity due to these major life stressors. And so part of autogynephilia is connected to your narrative self construct, how you like the stories you tell about yourself. And so
Yes, yes,
so
yes,
there
yes.
there,
Because
there
you're
so there's
about
a
to scramble it. If you step from normal across the line into eight full on AGP, you're about to scramble your narrative. Yourself. The story you tell yourself about yourself is about to
right.
just
Yeah.
get blown
Right.
up. Yeah, yeah. And
Particularly when there's an ideology out there pushing this narrative that like
right.
you're born a woman, you're
Yeah,
born on the inside, you've always been this way. Like
yeah,
the mainstream trans narrative has a ready stock of these narratives to take up and internalize that will completely mess you up and like give you a false conception of who you are. And that false narrative is part of the environmental stew that is very toxic and is leading to
yeah.
the explosion of this in our society, in combination with the pornography, in combination with these
Yes, yes. I was just
these
thinking that.
gender ideologies.
Yeah, the combination of the ideology and the ready availability of pornography and the kind of active promotion of it, especially for small kids, that the normal developmental process is has a lot of stressors in it. Let's put it that
Right.
way. I want to pause for just a moment though before we go any further because um, I want to be sure that people understand we're talking about when Ray Alex is talking about himself, he's talking about an autogynephilia transgender person. There are other forms of transgenderism, okay? And I wrote an article, I think I sent you this article that I wrote in the National Catholic Register about the different people who pin the label transgender on themselves. Because the fact is, you can call yourself transgender for any reason you want to. So I'm thinking that the story that Ray is telling us about his experience, I don't want you to think that I think that's the same thing as what happened to Chloe Cole or the same thing that happened to some of the female rapid onset gender dysphoria kids, or that is happening to, or that Leah Thomas did, Will Thomas did, who's a man who wants to win swimming championships. These people are not the same, but
Right.
if we're not
So
careful and we use the same word for all of those people, we're gonna create confusion. Just want to put that out there. I'm not saying, and Ray's not saying, that every single transgender person has the characteristics he's talking about. It's a very specific subset, I would say, of the trans experience. Is
yes,
that fair to say, Ray?
that is correct. And Leah Thomas almost certainly on a gonophile, no doubt.
Oh, you
uh,
think so?
oh
Oh,
yes, for sure. I mean,
oh, okay.
he on one of his private Instagram accounts, he liked a post about AGP, so it's
Oh,
obvious.
well. The
Um,
proof in a court of law. There you are. I'm
but
messing with
also,
you now.
yes, you're correct. I'm talking about the male case. So in females, it's
Yeah,
totally different.
right.
Um, and also, I should point out that people want to know, like, okay, well, you say these AGPs exist. Well, how many trans women are AGP? That's a common question. The research that I've done shows that the vast majority of trans-identified males in the Western world in the modern age are of the autogynephilic ideology. That is, in my opinion, can be established because the Blanchardian typology derives itself from a question of of heterosexuality. So it says that, or it from your sexuality. So you can sort of extrapolate the numbers if you have survey data that tells you the sexual orientation of the transgender population. And the
I
vast
see.
majority of transgender males are attracted to women. So therefore, because the leading hypothesis in regards to what causes gender confusion in males is an inversion of heterosexuality, we can assume that the vast majority of trans-identified males, because they are vastly heterosexual, they are of the autogynephilic ideology, which matches the actual anecdotal experience in the community. If you just, I've been in the community for 10 years. This is like,
Mm-hmm.
this is like, stereotypes have, they come from truth to some extent. So,
Right. But my sense is though that the young people who are saying they're trans are, some of them are quite different from what you're describing. I mean, the girls who are on TikTok too long or whatever it is, and maybe some of the boys are are of the homosexual type. Maybe they work out in their mind that it'd be easier to be a girl than to be a gay boy. And maybe that's not the right way to put it, but it does fit with the Blanchard
Right, right.
typology in a way. Okay, and you had a guy on your channel, that guy Seth,
Yes, I
who
love that
was.
interview. He's such a brave young man.
Oh, I do too. I loved him. I loved him a lot. Yeah, I just thought he was a very precious soul.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
anyway, it, you've mentioned a little bit about your family. How close were you to your family growing up? And when you decided to transition, what impact did that have on the rest of your family?
I've always been close with my parents. Like I've been very blessed to have a great mom and dad who, grew up in a stable home. They've been married for like 40 something years now. So it was a wonderful environment. I had a great childhood. And so I had a good relationship with them. Now, I kind of moved, to the Midwest. I grew up in Florida. So I wasn't as close to them, as if it's not like I was going over to dinner every week, but, we talked on the phone. We had good relationships. And when I transitioned, it definitely caused strain because the ideology taught me that if my parents did not immediately, take on my pronouns, take on my name, then they are transphobic bigots. And you know, luckily, I never really fully severed the relationship, and they never severed it with me. So we maintained good terms, and because they are loving parents, they wanted what's best for me, and they loved me through that whole process. And I know it was killing them, though. I know it was killing them,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
they didn't like kick me out. They didn't disown me. They didn't do anything like that. They just kept loving me. I'm sure they were praying for me, and but it caused a lot of strain because your parents, they raised you. They're not going to think you're the opposite sex.
Right. And they
Yeah,
picked out your name. They picked your
right,
name, and they picked it for a reason. And
right.
they're just so. And they you. This is a thing that has come up with some of the people that I've interviewed. That when you transition, you have to rewrite your whole past. You can't look at the photos of you before you were transitioned, or you can't
Right.
let other people see those photos because that
Yeah.
interrupts the narrative. And so, for your parents who are trying to manage that, it's really hard. So probably the fact that you were, 1,000 miles away from each other, that maybe helped. I don't know. In some respect, I don't know.
Yeah. But it was always like, it was always like yeah, it's put a strain. And then when I detransitioned, like my relations with my parents got so much better. It's just like,
I'm sure.
from like my mom's
Oh,
perspective, it's like her baby boy, she got her baby boy back.
yeah, yeah,
And that was very
yeah.
important because 3 years ago, my older brother passed. So she lost a boy, and then she gained a boy back, and so
Wow.
it's kind of been bittersweet for her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and my relationship with like my father is like a million times better. And so yeah, it's just because the thing is like when you ground your identity on a lie, your happiness is dependent on other people supporting the lie. Because when I went
Right.
home, like every time that they'd like, they tried their best to, quote unquote, respect my pronouns and use my name, but they'd slip up, of course.
Yeah.
And so every time they did that, that was like emotional, painful for me. And so I was always on edge all the time, waiting for those moments when I'd feel that emotional pain of like the slip up because it was violating my ego concept, my self image. And so I was always like, I always had this background anxiety. And this was true like in all walks of my life because the vast majority of trans women, 99%, don't pass as female. And so, you're always like kind of, but you're sort of like, you pass a little bit, maybe from like 50 yards off, you pass and you get closer. And then it's like, okay, well, how close do I have to get before they, realize that I'm male or like, maybe I
Right.
passed
Right.
upon first glance, but then when I open my mouth and it's like people do a double take a lot, that happened a lot. So I was always in this like ambiguous world of like anxiety and self-consciousness and neuroticism, like how are people thinking about me, how are people judging me, and just like meeting new people was weird. And it's just like it was very that was one of the primary drivers for me to detransition. But that played into my family life because I was never I always was self-conscious. I never just rested in my own identity. I never just
Mm-hmm.
rested in reality. And
Mm-hmm.
when you rest in reality, you don't have self-consciousness because you don't have to think about how are people judging
Right.
me, how are people looking at me, am I passing as male or female right now. And
Yeah.
that just creates, it induces neuroticism in otherwise normally healthy people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So once again, the transition itself generated the anxiety. It
Yes,
didn't solve it didn't solve a single problem
yes,
really.
exactly.
Um, so let's stop on this point. Let's point on, not end. We're still on a roll, so I'm not going to end. But I mean, I want to focus in on this point. What prompted you to transition or to
So
detransition or
to
you've been like
to
10
do
years, 10 years, or 8 years, you
yeah, it
said
was
you were
like,
living as a woman.
it's like 8 years. Part of it was the my initial motivation was I had an epiphany one day that natural is better, because I had had these those health problems I mentioned earlier, and and as part of being on this regimen, I had to like obviously I was on prescription medication to maintain my hormonal supplementation. I had to go to the doctor's office all the time to get labs drawn to get blood. So basically, it's like I was going to be a lifelong medical patient for life. And I was just sort of, I had an epiphany. I was like, you know, like in like other respects, I was trying to get off my prescription medication unrelated to like gender stuff. And I was like, well, why am I doing that? Because like natural's better. Well, it's the same case for all these gender drugs. So I realized like, I want to be whole in myself. So like I'm running on my own natural endocrine system. I'm not dependent on, exogenous medical interventions. I'm not a lifelong medical patient. And also I was getting to the point where like I've been on testosterone supplementation or testosterone suppression medication, and that has severe side effects. I've been on it for like 8 years. And so my doctors are pressuring me to get an orchiectomy where you remove the testicles so you don't produce testosterone, so you don't have to take the testosterone blockers. And I was at this decision point of basically having to decide whether to do that. And I was like, well, what do I want to do? And essentially I just had this epiphany. I was like, no, I'm just going to like get off the hormones. I'm going to just like, and at that exact point when had that epiphany, I wasn't like immediately deciding to like socially detransition. I just wanted to medically detransition. But the social detransition soon followed after it. And also at the time, my then ex or my ex-wife, or my like wife at the time, now ex-wife, she had started getting into gender critical stuff, like basically like reading and researching people who are like critical of mainstream gender identity ideology. And she started watching this like YouTube channel that interviewed a bunch of detransitioners. The channel's name is Benjamin Boyce's channel. He interviews tons of detransitioners. I started watching out of curiosity, and I just like having the concept of detransition made available to me, like it in a way provided a possibility model that I didn't previously think was a thing. Because
Right.
and once I realized that like no, you can actually detransition and like be happy on the other side, like it provided this idea. And then I started getting into like the actual criticisms of the ideology, and just like my whole worldview flipped upside down. And it's been a whirlwind ever since then in terms of like shifting ideological views. I went from like super progressive, very, liberal, you know, to, yeah, like a Democrat and blue voter. And just like, and I was very woke. And so part of like my detransition process was a de wokeification, if you could call it that, because all these ideologies are connected in some ways. And like
Yes, that's true.
the idea that trans women are women is a central dogma in the progressive woke ideology. And so it's connected to these other ideologies about race, gender, and sex and all this stuff. And so um
And ideas about reality.
yes,
Ideas about the human person. What does it mean to be a person? What's going to really make you happy? And with a radical autonomy at the center of that.
right.
And you had gone through enough pursuing of the radical autonomy that you were like,
Yeah.
This isn't doing it for me. So all of this is happening at the same time. I want to take a step back though. You mentioned that you were married. Yeah. Okay. So here's Ray living as a woman. What was your woman's name?
Rachel.
Rachel. Okay. So here's Ray living as Rachel, and you were married to a woman.
Yes, we met when I was trans identified.
Okay. And how did that work? How did you present yourselves to the outside world? And
Like,
how did
well,
you think
we
how did you wait, what was your internal narrative between the two of you? Did you think of yourself as a pair of lesbians or something? How did that work?
more like queer, I guess, which is just like amorphous, vague term that kind of captures a bunch of like, but yeah, we
Hmm.
kind of conceptualize. Like, I mean, I never really like truly identified like as a woman. I kind of was more like identified as more like trans feminine or non-binary or something like this. I never like full blown like I'm a woman, you know, like
Yeah, yeah.
I acknowledge that I'm like, you know, like I essentially identify as like trans, like I'm a trans woman. Some trans women are like, no, like I'm a woman and my transness is just incidental. Whereas like I was like, no, I'm just a full blown trans woman, and that's like kind of like how I identify. Because I was like smart enough to know that there's philosophical problems of like identifying as a woman, like what is a woman, and it's like, getting into all these philosophical debates. And so I realized it was like a philosophical dead end to try and defend the idea that I was really a woman, because then you have
Uh-huh.
to like, you know,
Okay.
it doesn't make sense philosophically, because then it's like a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, and it's like that doesn't make sense philosophically, and I
And
knew
that's
that.
where we are as a culture.
Right.
That's exactly where we are, yeah. But how did
So
this work for your wife? How did this work for her? What did she tell herself about who she was
um
married to and who she was?
I mean, it I when I transitioned, I had no problems finding women to date, but mostly bisexuals. It's very,
Wow.
very common. And
Interesting.
yeah, I dated lots of women, like you know, so it was not unusual. And and within the LGBT queer, you know, women, yeah, it's very common for trans women to date within like the bisexual queer women community. So yeah, and she conceptualized herself as more or less being in like a what's called like a sapphic relationship, where like, you know, woman loving woman, or you know, queer or something like that. So that's how we kind of conceptualized it. And you know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um I mean, she was happy in the relationship. Like when I initiated the divorce, she did not want to get divorced. So yeah, it's like and partly it's because, you know, there was financial entanglements as well, and that's complicated. I don't want to necessarily get into that, but
No, no, no,
um
no. You don't need to get into that. That's none of our business, really. But the two of you separated. Was this at the same time that you were detransitioning? Were these things related?
the detransition was like back in 2023, and then the divorce was initiated last year. So it
Mm-hmm.
didn't happen simultaneously, but it was part of the downfall of the relationship, because when I detransitioned and started identifying as a man, like it just caused a lot of problems, like in the relationship. Like she told me she wasn't attracted to me, like she wasn't like she didn't like the way I smelled anymore, because I had testosterone in my body. She's like, oh, I don't like the way you smell anymore. So it's like we basically like didn't have any chemistry, and the relationship devolved in kind of like a platonic thing.
Hmm.
And yeah, it was weird in a way.
Well, I
But
can imagine. I can imagine all kind of that.
yeah, well,
There wouldn't be many
the
templates for processing what you guys were
right.
doing
I
in the
mean, the
first place.
fundamental basis
Yeah.
of the marriage, at the time I got married, I was so confused in so many ways, on so many dimensions, that and it was not, you know, it was not a valid marriage. Is also at the time I was, you know, when we got married, I was we were polyamorous as well. So it was like,
Mm,
it was just, you know, every kind of, you know, alternative lifestyle, you know, we were living in to some extent or another. I was very into
yeah.
like alternative relationship models, like
Right. 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 Right.
polyamory, relationship anarchy, all these different, you know, radical ways to like, you know, structure relationships.
Right. When you take down the guardrails, you can go off the cliff in a lot of different directions.
Yes.
Actually, so you felt a desire to detransition because of the reasons that you've talked about. And as you transitioned, you ended up transitioning all the way into a very conservative traditional form of Catholicism. But it sounds like the detransition happened before the faith experience happened.
Yes, that's
Is that
correct.
right? Okay.
That's
And
correct.
was therapy part of your journey at any point, Ray?
No, I never really. I've never really been much of a therapy person,
Okay. Okay.
for
So
whatever
you didn't have
reason.
like you didn't I mean because for some of the people I've talked to, they had unexplored trauma, an unprocessed trauma that they needed help processing, you know. So some people went needed therapeutic help with that kind of thing. Others were didn't do therapy so much, but they had powerful religious experiences that was part of the whole process of leaving the pride identity behind, whatever it was for that particular person. But your story isn't like either of those. Yours is your own unique thing, it sounds like.
Yes, but I've always been a seeker after the truth. I've always been, you know, um, and some of my critics online will say that like I'm flighty.
You what?
I'm flighty, like
Oh.
sort of like jump around from different ideologies to like ideology. So I have a lot of people predicting that like this Catholicism thing is just gonna be like a temporary phase, and I'll jump to the next thing next month or something. That's not how I feel about it at all. I feel like I finally come home to reality, to groundedness, to truth, and it's I'm like a changed man. I'm a new person. So I'm it's like Jesus says, it's like you're a new or Saint Paul, you're like a new person in Christ, and I really do
Hmm.
feel like a transformed man. And I also want to relate to the viewers a critical part of like my faith journey, which is that after I detransitioned, the testosterone came back, and subsequently my libido came back, and subsequently all the paraphilic desires that led me down the transition pathway came back. And so
Oh.
suddenly I was having to deal with these autogynephilic urges again. I had all these urges to cross dress, to engage in fetishistic behavior. So that all came flooding back, and I came to like, how do I manage this? How do I deal with it? And I discovered a community, and how I learned about autogynephilia and then started researching it. There's a community of people who are like, self-identify as autogynephiles, and like, rather than saying this is pseudoscience, this is debunked, it's like, no, I am autogynephile. It's a small community, but within that community, like, the standard advice of how to manage this is that you need to somehow integrate it into your life. Otherwise, if you try and repress it, you're going to get into these binge purge cycles. You're going to, by repressing these desires, you're going to lead to psychological damage or something, and you're going to torture yourself. And so and initially I tried to suppress it, and I was like, but then eventually, um yeah, I started like cross-dressing and stuff. I started getting into all this fetishistic stuff, and like, I started watching, transgender pornography again, and it just really started escalating. But the common advice in the community is that, oh, that's perfectly okay, because the problem previously when you're trans identified was that I brought my kink out to the public world. But as long as I keep the kink in the bedroom, I'm not hurting anyone. So it's no big deal. It's just like, it's just an outlet. It's sort of outlet to prevent me from retransitioning. Because actually, there's differences between males and female detransitioners. Male detransitioners are more likely to retransition. And so, partly because the autogynephilic urges are stronger, whereas in females, it's more of a social contagion thing. So, like, there's less of a motivation to retransition. Whereas in males, they're dealing with these strong underlying sexual desires that motivate them. And unless you learn to manage them in a healthy way, you're going to like deal with these urges and start, going down the same pathway that drove you down in the first place. And so I tried for a while to integrate it to, I was like, doing cross dressing here and there, like around the house, and, and, but that was eventually, it was so unhealthy, it's so degenerate that, in a moment of, conscience, and one of these, fetishistic sessions, like, God convicted me, pierced my heart, and I had a crisis of consciousness, or crisis of conscience, where God was like, you need to stop all this. Like, and I was also like heavily addicted to marijuana as well, which fed into the sort of sensation seeking, the novelty seeking, the fetishism, because I consider it like an aphrodisiac, and it was like, dopamine seeking, and it's all connected, and it was like a trigger for the fetishistic sessions as well.
Right. Right.
And And so, yeah, in that moment of crisis, God was like, give it all up, stop. And I stopped right away. I threw it all away. I had this crisis of conscience. Like, it was like an instant. It was like my Damascus Road experience. I really, or like Saint Augustine having that moment of like, that conversion. It was a true conversion experience, and
Take and read. Take and read.
yes,
Right out of the Confessions, right,
yes,
right.
exactly,
But
exactly.
so you threw away all of your
Yeah,
garments, and you
I
threw
I
away your
got rid of all the
marijuana,
paraphilia, got rid of all the stuff. I just like, and yeah,
the
and I just
drugs, and the
I
pornography.
just immediately got drawn to the Catholic Church, and this is in February of this year. This happened.
And so wait, you were not a religious person whatsoever before February of this year?
No, that's not true. I was
Oh, okay.
I was like I was spiritual but not religious, because after I left my faith, my faith of my youth, which is Southern Baptism, I went through this long phase of atheism. But then I got into like the I sort of stopped becoming a materialist and an atheist, but I was into like spiritual. So I believed in like a spiritual reality, like that there's some universal consciousness of some kind, or that I believe that miracles are possible, or that the supernatural realm exists. But it's all framed in terms of like the esoteric, the New Age, the occult, paganism, the
Mm-hmm.
culture. I tried Eastern philosophies. I tried every different spiritual system in the world. I've always been a spiritual seeker. I
Mm-hmm.
did like psychedelics when I was in college. I've always like exploring, but it never satisfied me. Like Saint Augustine said, the heart is restless until it rests in you. I was very restless, incredibly restless person spiritually, and so initially, when I was after I detransitioned, I briefly flirted with going back to the evangelicalism of my youth, um, and because I had the same sort of like a crisis of conscience in regards to my sexual behavior, but I struggled, because that my intellectual coherence demanded that I take conservative theology seriously, which had the conservative traditional ethic on homosexuality. And so I liked it because it clearly rejected the trans stuff, which is helpful to my own personal case, but it also rejected the homosexual case. But my wife at the time, I'm now ex-wife, was a hardcore gay rights activist her whole life. So when I said like, oh, now I'm evangelical, like she threatened divorce. It blew up. It caused so much animosity, and like I backed down, and I kind of like had a I kind of like I wasn't firm in my faith because I was causing too much tension in the marriage. So I kind of reverted back to this sort of like progressive Christianity, or like where I was like going to like the Episcopal Church, who's like they're pro LGBT in the church, and so I kind of like had this like really watered down form of liberal theology where it's like it's like I didn't really take it seriously, and then I lost seriously my faith, and I kind of got back into the New Age stuff. Then when I had my most recent true conversion experience, and I found the Catholic faith, and then now I'm like, I have confidence and a strong faith in the Orthodox traditional perspective, and I'm not like going to back down. And because part of it was like realizing that to accept this, I have to be comfortable with the idea that people are going to think I'm a homophobe. People are going to think I'm a bigot. Like people are going to like, I'm going to be ostracized from the the LGBT community and stuff. And people are gonna have all these judgments on me, and I just came to accept that. And so that was the big hurdle for me, was like getting over the issue of the gay stuff, because I had been a liberal and Democrat pro gay my entire life,
Right, right.
because I had a liberal sexual ethics where basically as long as two adults are loving and consenting, that's all that matters.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So at this point, so this is in February of this year that this happened. And where were you guys in your marriage at that point?
The divorce was not yet finalized, but we were not living together.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
So that, yeah. So a lot's going on. A lot's going on.
right.
And then I
Right.
remember you saying on Substack that you came into the church just this Easter. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct. I was confirmed
So
just this Easter.
So
Yeah.
this was a real quick journey. A lot of times they'll have a whole year's worth of preparation and education and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But you mentioned that you had a priest that thought it was important that you come in right away. Do you mind telling us a little bit about
Yes.
that?
So typically, you're right. The OCA process, which is like the educational catechesis process, prior to getting confirmed, it usually starts in the fall and it goes in later. But I talked to the priest and he's like, well, the purpose of that is to make sure that you agree with the church teachings. But part of my conversion experience was grappling with the fact that whether or not I'm going to accept the church teachings. And I had no problems with all the orthodoxy except the gay issues. But once I accepted the gay
Hmm.
issue, all the rest of the orthodoxy, the doctrines, the Catholic Church, the full acceptance of the magisterium, all that came naturally to me because like I had already been studying theology and Christianity for quite some time. I just hadn't really like allowed myself to fully assent to the full magisterium because like of the gay issue. But once I got over that hurdle, like the rest of it came easy. So from my priest perspective, like I mean, he could probably tell I'm like more of like an intellectual type of guy, and so like um, and it said that if I caught up on all the past, because all the OCA lectures were recorded, so I just like binged watched like the entire year's worth of like catechesis. He said as long as I do that before the Easter Vigil, I can be confirmed, which it's such a blessing because you know after doing this, I still struggle with temptation and like having like the sacraments of the church, the church life, having being a full member of the church, like that's been important to like my ability to manage this in a healthy way and to overcome these desires and to conquer them and to live out a life of like chastity and like purity, and like without the church it'd be impossible. And now I think that it is actually impossible without a sort of transcendental morality. You're not going to beat this. Like a lot of guys who struggle with these AGP and cross-dressing and paraphilia and pornography and all this stuff, like they try and beat it on their own. And like and a lot of people say like I'm just repressing and that I'm doomed to retransition. I'm doomed to relapse. I'm doomed to do this, do this. It's like because without God, this is not possible. Because like the tools of secular psychology that they recommend to try and like, oh, you just need to engage in your kinky moderation. You just need to like
Right,
it's
right,
like no, it doesn't
right.
work.
And what you discovered on your own is that theory is incorrect. It's simply not correct to say that you can be a moderate, you can indulge in pornography moderately, or that you can indulge in a kink moderately. And that thought process has led a lot of people into full-on sexual addiction of one kind or another, because the fact is, if you don't confront the temptation and deal with it, it won't go away. It won't go away
Yes, yeah.
by
It
itself,
just
and
it just
it does require grace to do it. Were you baptized before you came into the Catholic Church? Were you
I
baptized
was
as you?
baptized as a Southern Baptist when I was 6 years
Okay,
old. So
okay,
yeah,
yeah, and so
which is
that
a grace of
that
its own, right?
that's what I was just getting ready to say. The baptism was valid. They baptized you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, so you didn't have to be
Yes,
rebaptized, right?
yes, that's
You
correct.
didn't have to have a conditional baptism, but that means that was a graced event in your life.
Yes,
And
yes,
we have no way of knowing how all the different channels of grace are
yeah.
working. You know
I
what I mean?
I
Yeah.
relate to Saint Augustine because it was the graces of his mother, Saint Monica,
His
praying for
mom.
him
Oh
for
my
all those
gosh.
years. So I'm
Yeah.
sure my parents, how many
Yeah.
prayers did they say? Please, please, Lord, bring Gary back. I'm sure they prayed thousands of prayers. All those graces
Yeah.
probably flowed to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
And
really,
how do they feel? How do your old Southern Baptist parents feel about you becoming a papist? Is this a problem?
um, I was a little worried at first telling my dad because
Yeah. Yeah.
he had sent me some things from some fiery Calvinist certain preachers like John MacArthur who really are anti Catholic, but my dad and my mom have seen the transformation in my life. They've
Yeah.
seen that I'm a different person. They've seen that I'm on
Yeah.
fire for Jesus, and I'm and what's interesting is like I go to this beautiful cathedral here in St. Louis, and it's the most gorgeous building
Oh.
ever.
Oh.
And I sent pictures to my dad, and he's going around to his church, his little Southern Baptist church, and look at how beautiful this is. Like isn't it wonderful
Yeah.
that they are constructing this place
Yeah.
to worship God?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
and my dad is a very faithful man. He reads the
Yeah,
Bible every day. He's I never appreciated the fact that he was a good Christian man
yeah.
my whole life. And now like we send each other Bible verses, we pray for each other. Like he
Oh,
sends me like his daily devotionals and Bible verses. And so like, I think I'm open. I think he may not have realized that like, you can be on fire for Jesus as a Catholic.
right, right. Yeah.
And so yeah, now he never says anything bad about Catholicism to me. Like, I mean, I'm
Well,
sure he has his theological differences, but like
right, right, right.
he sees the transformation.
Yeah. Well, compared to you being a woman, he's this. I'm sure they're relieved.
Yeah.
We have our son back. He's a papist, but we have our son back.
Yes.
So yeah. That I have long thought that the pressure that the Christian community as a whole feels from the sexual revolution. One of the things that it's doing is it's driving the Christians together, right? A lot of the old divisions are just breaking down. Just we all see that we have to get closer to Jesus, or we're going to be swept away by the cultural forces. And if we all get closer to Jesus, we're going to end up being closer to each other.
Right.
And I have felt that since 2008 when I worked on the Prop 8 campaign in California. I mean, it was amazing. If you had been in San Diego in 2008, well, you in 2008, I don't even know how old you were, but in that period of time, in that moment, the spirit was moving in that city. It was an amazing experience, that people are,
Right.
that our auxiliary bishop in San Diego, Bishop Corleone, who's now the Archbishop of San Francisco. um, he was one of the big ringleaders of getting the money together and getting all the Catholic community on board and so on and so forth. And there he is at this big mega church, this big Protestant evangelical church that looks like an entertainment venue, kind of
Right.
kind of church. Um, and then we went across the street to the San Diego mission that was built by Father Junipero Serra. It was not grand like your cathedral in St. Louis, but unbelievably beautiful. Tiny but beautiful. Every single
Right.
square inch is covered with something amazing to look at. But there we all were together. That was the
Right.
point. We were all there together, working on something that you know, yeah, we got these problems, we got these theological problems, but this has to be pleasing to God that
Right.
we're working on this issue
Right.
of common concern. This has to
Yeah.
this has to be what he wants.
When Our Lady of Fatima appeared to those children, she said the final battle with Satan is going to be between marriage and family.
Yeah.
And that impacts,
Yep.
all Christians. And like,
Yeah.
our society hates Jesus's message more than ever. And so like, the Jesus followers are, it doesn't matter who you are. If you follow a traditional ethic, it doesn't matter if you're sola scriptura, whatever. Like if you're following the biblical ethic on sexuality, you're going to be hated by modern society.
Right.
And so
Right.
that brings us all together, I think. And I think that's
And I
that's
help.
a really nice point to emphasize is our commonalities and our common
Hmm.
enemies. Um,
Right. Right. Which are sometimes easier to see, but
right,
and I do my best to call attention to the commonalities, Ray. Because I really believe that Catholic teaching on marriage and family and human sexuality is coherent. All the moving parts fit together, which
right,
is, you cannot say that about the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution just spins off one contradiction after another, and the Catholic position is coherent. And I try to say to people, look, this is the common heritage of the whole Christian tradition, and it will bless anyone who embraces it. I don't care who you. If you embrace it, it will bless you in some
right,
way. So that's the way I try to put it out there. I'll let somebody else, you know, do the full-on conversion, refuting sola scriptura or whatever else has to happen. I don't. I'm not worried
yeah,
about that part.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, one thing I always like to ask people who have made this type of journey that you've made, is there anything that you would like to say to the family members of people who are struggling with this kind of thing? Thinking about your whole journey, when you looking back on it, you can see that you were the source of problems and tension in the family, and
right,
you have the perspective of
right.
going into it and coming out of it. Is there anything that you can say to the family members to give them hope, to
Yeah,
persevere, and
yeah. Don't
to know
don't
it's
give up
helpful?
hope. Don't give up hope. Keep praying, because the average age of detransition is like 8. It takes it's like 8 years. So it's like,
Really?
yes. So which is why the data is misleading, because they don't do follow-ups for 8 years. Um, so they say, oh,
Oh,
the
I
like
see what you
they
mean.
say they see the detransition rate is low. Well, you're not following up after 8 years.
Right,
So don't
right.
give up hope. Just keep praying, and yeah, I mean, that's keep loving, and keep don't push them away, and like, yeah, and that's all you can do, really. But hope is out there, and anything is possible with Jesus. So
Now, do you know sometimes people want to try to talk their relatives or their loved ones into the correct position? That, oh, I have information for you, son. Wouldn't you like to read this book that I found just for you? Um, my sense is that that's not usually welcome while the person is still in the throes of the ideology. Can you speak about that a little bit with the benefit of hindsight? I don't know if anybody tried that
yes.
with you. If,
Yeah, I mean, I was very stubborn. I think most trans-identified people are stubborn in their ideology, because there's sort of like, there's a moral. I'm on the right side of history. You're just an ignorant bigot, and like, I have all the answers, and so you're giving me this literature. There must be something wrong with it, because I already know, a priori, that I'm on the right side of history and you're wrong, and like, so it really does. Yeah, I think it requires grace. And which is why prayer is so important, because we can petition for graces. And but yeah, I don't know, it's one of those things where like, the ideology is so rigid, and there's a lot of like people out there within these communities, because particularly within the trans identified male population, which they're often high IQ, very smart, very artistic, and so they're very well researched on this topic, and so but researched in a way that, like, they're wrong, but they have a lot of rhetorical sophistry and clever arguments, and a sort of, it really requires a lot of expertise to like cut through the ideology, because if you just look in the science is on our side, and they have all these, they kind of, it's a veneer of plausibility, and a veneer of scientific, there's like, oh yeah, all the mainstream, medical establishments, the APA, the AMA, everything's on our side, it's, so yeah, it requires, it's really hard to directly challenge on the intellectual side, which is why I think the more like emotional side is more important, the spiritual side, because yeah, they're gonna dig in their heels, they're gonna resist. It requires that internal conversion experience. I think in order to, because it really is like it's almost like a gestalt shift. It's like a paradigm shift. You have to really like, you know, but also one thing that's effective, I think that I've seen that's effective, is like sharing stories of detransitioners. So if you see a powerful testimony from a detransitioner, you can just share it, and like maybe they won't watch it, but maybe they will watch it. And having, like I said before, like having a possibility model is important.
mhm.
If you don't think that detransition is a possibility, then you're never going to consider it as an option. And so yeah, that's kind of what I would say. But yeah, don't give up hope, and keep praying.
Yeah, and the correcting the intellectual errors can come further down the road. So once you became convicted that this was the wrong path and that there was a possible alternative, you became more open at that point to hearing contradictions to the talking points that you've been hearing for 8 years. Um,
Right.
but you had to get to that point first before you even willing to listen to it. And all that stuff was bouncing off, would
Right.
have bounced off if somebody had presented to
Right.
you sooner. Yeah,
Mhm.
because we have people reach out to us all the time with these questions. You can imagine the letters that we get. The people are heartbroken over their family members and
Right.
so on. What should we do and what should we not
Right.
do? And it's really it's not easy to figure out when's the right
Right.
time to open your mouth and so on and so
Right.
forth. So,
I will give a recommendation. One of my good friends is a detransitioner herself, named Maya Poet. She's on Substack, and she's very, very, very smart, and she has a lot of great advice for parents, particularly for parents of RGD girls who are, are that kind of like autistic ideology. And she is the best advice. And she actually has a consulting business where I don't know if it's a full blown business, but she consults with parents all the time. And she understands autogynephilia as well. So she is, can help with the boys. I would recommend her work. Or read some of her Substack articles.
hmm
Her work is directly reaching out to parents and how to help parents. So
uh-huh.
Maya Poet on Substack,
Okay.
I would look her
Okay.
up.
So you send me that link and we'll put it in the show notes, Maya Poet.
Okay.
And and that brings me to my final question for you. Where can people learn more about Ray Alexander Williams? Where can they read your writing? Where can they see your videos?
So my Substack is easy, rayxwilliams.com. YouTube also easy. Rayx Williams is the channel. So I have a bunch now. For caution on my YouTube channel, I've kept up my old videos, and I have some videos of there where I'm cross dressed and where I had a totally different perspective of my management of autogynephilia. So not all the videos on there reflect my current opinion on the Catholic sexual ethic or the proper way to manage this. And so, I'm leaving them up there for, educational purposes to realize that you can
Mm-hmm.
change your mind on these things. But for someone
Mm-hmm.
where that would be like a trigger or like, upsetting, like, yeah, like watch my more recent content on my channel.
Right. Right.
Just a fair warning.
Right.
And then, yeah, I'm also on Twitter too, where you can see me getting into some feisty conversations with people about these topics.
Right. Right. Well, Ray, it has been a real pleasure getting to know you. I appreciate your candor. I appreciate your learning on this matter. I mean, you have obviously educated yourself quite a bit on these topics in a way that I'm not familiar with, and I think a lot of other people will find it very enlightening. So I want to thank you so very much for being my guest on today's episode of the Dr. J Show.
Well, thank you so much. It was my great honor to be here.
Hey, thanks for watching. Since you're a fan of the Ruth Institute, you should really sign up for our free e-newsletter. We'll send you a free download of our report refuting the top 5 gay myths. It's filled with our unique combination of personal stories and nerdy data. You can click on the footnotes and be taken directly to the references. It's totally free, so sign up at the link below today.